the world is facing uncertain and turbulent times. And I'm conscious that it's a conceit of every era and generation to believe that the challenges they face are unique and unprecedented. And it's only with the benefit of hindsight and the long interpretive lens of history that we can impose some structure and coherence on the past and make what is highly uncertain at the time appear settled and somewhat orderly. But with that caveat, it's my view that we are at one of the turning points, at least in modern day world affairs. I think we can broadly trace three eras in global order since the end of the Second World War. The post-war era, built from the ashes of World War II, was initially a period of great optimism and heightened expectations of international cooperation and harmony. This gradually gave way to the grinding contests of the Cold War, and though much of the initial flush of optimism of that period was not realised, the era roughly from 1945 to 1991 was nonetheless a period of peace, stability and progress for much of humanity, especially compared to what had gone before in the first half of the 20th century. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc ushered in what came to be known as the post-Cold War era. It was a time of growing global trade, economic integration, interlinked trading routes and supply chains, international cooperation and rising prosperity and prospects for billions. And the global ethos of this era was largely uncontested, underpinned by the unrivaled dominance of the sole superpower at the time, the United States. Now today, we are in a new era. It doesn't yet have a name, but it is characterised by growing international competition and sharpened contest over the architecture, the norms and the ideals that should govern the world. It's characterised by a fragmentation of the global trading system and the return of great power rivalry. And it's characterised by a United States that is both less willing and less able to play its traditional role as guarantor of the status quo. And in a nutshell, it's this backdrop which is why the Casey Oration, what we're here tonight to hear, has come about, to provide a forum to grapple with this new world order and to discuss how Australia, which has thrived as a sovereign state in the past two eras, can continue to do so. Now, Lord Casey was a witness to and a participant in the last great global upheaval. He fought in the First World War, serving in both the Gallipoli campaign and on the Western Front. A parliamentarian and federal treasurer in the 1930s, he was then appointed as Australia's first ever diplomatic representative to the United States in 1940, a time when the United States had not yet entered the Second World War. He later served in Winston Churchill's War Cabinet as its representative in the Middle East, before being appointed as Imperial Governor in Bengal, India. Returning to Australia and to politics after the war, he was the Minister for External Affairs from 1951 to 1960 in the Menzies government, and then served as Governor-General from 65 to 69. Now, Casey's time in leadership saw Australia grapple with the end of the British Empire, decolonisation, the emergence of independent states to our north, and the rise of the United States as a preeminent global power. And things like the ANZUS Treaty, the Australia-Japan Commerce Agreement, and the Colombo Plan all date from Casey's era. And these initiatives and the attitudinal and policy shifts that accompanied them were instrumental in the reorientation of Australian statecraft, a reorientation that helped us successfully navigate a new era in global politics. Now, Casey served as External Affairs Minister for 9 years, and it's a record that has only been eclipsed once since, and that's by our guest speaker tonight, Alexander Downer. And I can think of no one more fitting to give the first Casey Oration, because, like Casey, Alexander Downer helped steer the ship of the Australian state during highly turbulent times. Civil war in Papua New Guinea, the Asian financial crisis, Indonesia's democratisation, East Timor's painful path to independence, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the Bali bombings, and the rise of Islamist terrorism as a threat to our security, natural disasters of an unprecedented scale, including the Boxing Day tsunami, and conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. These were just some of the challenges that Alexander had to grapple with during his 11 plus years as Australia's Foreign Minister. And like Casey, he also served in diplomatic roles abroad, in Brussels prior to his entry into politics, as a highly successful High Commissioner to London following his retirement from politics, and as the UN Secretary General's Special Advisor on Cyprus. He also served as Executive Chair of the International School of Government at King's College London, a trustee of the International Crisis Group, is the current chair of the UK think tank Policy Change, and is the chairman of Gold Hydrogen, an ASX-listed hydrogen company. At a personal level, I first came to know Alexander when I was appointed an advisor in his office when he was the Foreign Minister from 2004 to 2006. And before that time, being a career diplomat working in the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Alexander was a titanic figure whose presence loomed very large for those of us in the department. He'd already been Foreign Minister for some 8 years when I joined his office. He was familiar with all the diplomatic players and actors globally. He knew the issues inside out and was more across the detail of any issue than anyone inside his own department. So to go to work for him and to presume to advise him was quite an intimidating prospect. But it was also an exhilarating experience for a young aspiring diplomat to see one of Australia's most effective foreign ministers operating at the top of his game, to witness the intersection of foreign policy and domestic politics in our Westminster political system, and to gain an appreciation of the clear, principled but nonetheless pragmatic worldview Alexander held about Australia and our place in the international system. And it also gave me a taste for and of politics, prompting a shift in my own life trajectory that continues to this day. I'm certain that Alexander will impart some of his immense wisdom and experience to us this evening. Please join me in welcoming to the lectern, Alexander Downes.
Well, thanks, Dave, very much for that very kind introduction. It reminds me that I used to say to those who came to work for me, your first priority is to make me look good. And Dave obviously failed in that task at that time, but things have got better. And Brad Haynes is here, who also used to work for me. He also failed to make me look good, but he certainly helped to give us all a good laugh in the office and gave very good and very sound advice, as did Dave. I really am honoured to give this first ever R.G. Casey oration, because R.G. Casey was, and as Dave has made clear, the longest serving Foreign Minister of Australia up until whatever date it was when I reached that benchmark. But he was, importantly, because the length of service isn't really terribly relevant, he was importantly a very significant foreign minister. And Dave said a little bit about it. When he became the foreign minister, Robert Menzies was well and truly in power. He'd been in power for a couple of years, and Casey replaced Garfield Barwick, who was a truly distinguished foreign minister and was responsible for the ANZUS alliance more than any other single person. But Casey became the foreign minister, and Dave made this point. I think it's really important to remember, during a period of decolonisation. So before the Second World War, the most important capitals for Australian diplomacy were Washington, of course, London, The Hague and Paris. Maybe Tokyo we should include in that list as well. But after the Second World War, as independence swept through the world, or the colonised world, then new forms of government were created. In Indonesia in 1949, or 47 is their figure, but 49 is, for our point of view, the point of their independence. through to other parts of Southeast Asia as they all became increasingly independent. And Casey was the foreign minister, Minister for External Affairs, as they said in those days, who had to navigate these incredibly difficult changes, navigate them in a context. And the thing about diplomacy is you always need to understand the context. This was the context of the Cold War, where the Soviet Union and its allies wanted to spread communism as an ideology around the world, and we were hugely resistant to it. And they used these independence movements ruthlessly to try to spread communism. And Casey was obviously well aware of this. I mean, he knew India very well, having at one stage been the governor of Bengal. I suppose that's largely, not all, Calcutta is still in India, but it's largely Bangladesh today. But so he knew these countries and he knew these people, and I think helped with the really, in practice, the very beginnings of Australia's successful engagement with Asia. I would say one of the greatest achievements of that period was in 1957, the negotiation and signing of the Australia-Japan Commerce Agreement. That was the great step forward in Australia's engagement with Asia. And if you're a Labour Party voter, let me say to you, your party voted against this. Your party was totally opposed to this change and mounted demonstrations on the streets of this city and other cities in Australia against the Commerce Agreement in 1957. The Labour Party has often been a very backward-looking show, and it certainly was at that time. So Casey was a hugely important figure, became the Governor-General, of course, in the end, and a member of the British Parliament because he became a member of the House of Lords. So I spent a bit of time talking about him, and Dave did, because we need to remember him. When I became the Foreign Minister, something my predecessor, Gareth Evans, had instituted was the building of a new building for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So I didn't have anything to do with the decision to build it. I just had to work out how we were going to finance it, and that's usually the case with Labour. And then you have to work out how to pay for it. That's why people vote Liberal, to pay the bills. Never a very popular thing to have to do. Not only did I inherit that part of it, but I sat down with the then Secretary of the Department, Philip Flood, and we both agreed, or he agreed with me, that we should name not just the building but the various rooms after long-serving foreign ministers and trade ministers and secretaries of the department. So we named the building the R.G. Casey Building in honour of the then longest-serving foreign minister. I know what you're thinking, it should be renamed. I noticed there isn't even a men's cubicle in the toilet named after me. And I can't blame them. So where are we today? Having had that little sweep through history, we need to understand the context of where we are. And Dave said a little bit about that. How did we get here? We had if you like, the simplicity of the Cold War dichotomy between the free nations as we saw it and communism. And that dichotomy where allies were formed, Western allies were formed, the notion of the Western alliance grew, went from strength to strength, ANZUS, NATO, there was CETO, you might remember, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organisation, and so on. So very strong alliances developed, and there was some controversy, but not a lot of controversy, about foreign policy. It was seen to be just axiomatic that we would support the cause of freedom. Okay, the Cold War comes to an end in the fall of the Berlin Wall at the end of 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the atomizing of the Soviet Union in 1991, and we moved into what you might call the second phase of the post-war era, Second World War era, the unipolar period. This was the period of the triumph of the liberal, democratic, capitalist system all around the world. So countries flocked to embrace that system. The Russians elected Boris Yeltsin, you'll remember. They privatized much of their economy, mainly to kleptocrats, admittedly, but anyway, that's another story, how they did it. But the countries of East Europe were liberated, had democracy spread through there, became capitalist systems in the end, leading to them joining both NATO and the European Union. This was a period of great triumph, if you like, for the liberal, democratic, capitalist system. And this was seen as very much the end of a journey of human evolution to get to this point. I mean, Francis Fukuyama called it the end of history. That's of course absurd. No, it seems particularly absurd now, but it seemed absurd at the time, I thought. But it was also seen to be the end of a road. That might be the best way of putting it, that we'd finally got to this point in history where liberal democracy was embraced. What went wrong with this? There were all sorts of interventions in the cause of liberal democracy that I won't run through here, but you remember the Kosovo War, for example. You remember Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. There were all sorts of reasons for interventions in these wars, but behind the thinking of those interventions was a belief that we could keep spreading the notion of liberal democracy and market economies into these countries as well. We got kind of bogged down in Afghanistan and Iraq, as you know, and I think this had quite an important effect on the thinking and the confidence of Western leaders and Western politicians at the time. I also think the other great blow to their confidence, to confidence in the liberal market system, if you like, was the global financial crisis. It was really a North Atlantic financial crisis. It wasn't so relevant to this part of the world, although the Australian government certainly blew away its budget surplus and mounted a huge amount of debt in response to it. But it was much more significant economically in Europe and in North America. I think this was an inflection point, if you like, in Western thinking, and led to what I might call here a loss of confidence. We went into an age of uncertainty. So when it came to global crises, the West, particularly the Americans, but not just the Americans, supported by their European allies and sometimes, no doubt, the Australian government, the West was hesitant and uncertain in how to respond. There are all sorts of examples I could bore you with, but there was the Arab Spring and how we would all respond to the Arab Spring. We're sort of thinking this is great, these countries are going to become more democratic, but we didn't really know how to respond. We ended up by being on the side in Syria of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and the Russians on the side of President Assad and his dictatorship. It seemed an odd place for us to end up in. We had Obama's red line. But really importantly, we had the change in attitudes to both China and to Russia. In the case of China, there was a hope. I'm not sure I particularly shared this myself, but a hope that China would become increasingly constructively integrated into the international community through the WTO and through other international institutions. It became increasingly important economically as a trading partner, as an investment partner, and so on. And we thought all this would lead to good things. I mean, I was a bit more, in self-defense here, I was a bit more sceptical about that. but that was the hope. I mean, maybe we should use the word hope rather than necessarily prediction. As for Russia, this is a long story of how this happened, but I was sitting there, I don't know if either Dave or Brad were with me, in Munich. I don't think either of you were there, in Munich in February 2007, when President Putin got up and made his famous speech. I think this was a pivotal speech, actually, in European foreign policy. Putin got up and basically proclaimed the end of Russia's engagement with Western countries, an attempt to integrate with Western countries, and proclaimed that Western countries were hostile to the interests of Russia, and Russia wanted to re-establish itself as a great power because it had been humiliated by the left, the West. Not humiliated by the left, normally embraced by the left, but humiliated by the West. And the reaction of Europe at that time, I was sitting in the room there with foreign ministers and presidents and prime ministers, including Angela Merkel, their reaction was one of horror. How could this possibly have happened? The reaction of the Americans was, you know, this speech was very unfortunate. So they had, if you like, a warning that their power was now going to be challenged by a kind of resurgent Russia. And the reaction was to do nothing about it, because this was the age of uncertainty. So what happened the following year was Russia invaded Georgia and seized part of Georgia. What was the Western reaction? Almost nothing. Well, that sent a message to Putin. Medvedev was also the prime minister. I think Medvedev might have been the president at that time, actually, not Putin, but Putin was the prime minister. Putin was the guy who ran the show. And then, you know, fast forward to 2014, that's the beginning, not 2022, 2014, the beginning of the Ukraine war, when the Russians invade Crimea and take part of the eastern Donbass. What was the Western reaction to that? There was a lot of tut-tutting. There were some sanctions on individual Russians, I seem to recall. There was Sarkozy and, it might have been Sarkozy's successor, actually, and Merkel trying to negotiate the Minsk Accords for a ceasefire with Putin, which were very unsuccessful, not backed up with any peacekeeping or force or threat of the use of force. That's my point. The reaction of the West was one of uncertainty. And this sent a message again to Putin that he could march on, which he attempted to do in 2022. So my whole point is here to use a phrase that Donald Rumsfeld used to like to use: weakness is provocative. By being weak, by being uncertain, being unsure about what to do, and soft in responses to bad behaviour, including towards China over its occupation of islands in the south, or reefs in the South China Sea, and its threats to Taiwan, the West has opened up opportunities for a new coalition which has rallied together against the West. So that brings us to today, and I'm going to finish my remarks by talking about today. So we have this coalition, and remember, it's a coalition, albeit an informal one, between China, Iran and Russia. And remember that of those three, the one that really counts is China, the second biggest economy in the world, 1.2 billion people or so, behemoth when it comes to economy, and geographically, of course, a very large area with a huge diaspora as well, spread around the world. So bear that in mind. Then there is Iran, run by a theocracy, as you know, theological extremists, political extremists true, but theological extremists who want to eliminate Jews from the Middle East, in particular get them out of Israel and destroy Israel as a Jewish state. And of course destroy Western influence in the Middle East. And then you have Russia. What do these countries all have in common? They're very different countries, very different histories. You can think about Russia and China historically not having a very happy relationship, often a relationship of real antipathy and grievance. Iran a bit different, but you know, what they have in common is what we need to remember. They want to destroy the influence of America and the West and the default position in global politics of the liberal democratic market-based system. They want to destroy that. It's not that they're completely against markets, they're a bit against markets, but they're not completely against markets. It's not that they are necessarily completely against any form of democratic involvement. Although China pretty much is, but not completely, it is they want to destroy altogether the influence of those countries, of our countries, and they want to replace it with a new world order. So this presents for us a huge challenge, and that brings me to President Trump. So during this age of uncertainty, we've had Obama for 8 years of it, we had Trump for just 4 years, and we had Biden for just 4 years, and we had America not quite sure what to do. President Trump has come to power with a plan to try to reverse all of this. And it has been a pretty brutal 50 days since he's come to power, as he started the process very rapidly of implementing that plan. To get some water. Of implementing that plan. Thanks, David. So the media will tell you this is a period of chaos. And I say it's not at all a period of chaos. Trump outlined all of these things that he's done well before the election. I was in America for much of last year, where I'm a visiting fellow at Stanford University. I saw him on TV night after night, as you still do, talking about his plan and outlining his plan. Even tariffs. He mentioned it over and over again that he wanted to introduce tariffs. We can come back to that later. But all of the things he said he would do, he has been doing. He hasn't been doing anything differently. So for the media, who are shocked and surprised, and many of them, of course, appalled at what he's been saying, and what he has his own use of language, I'll admit that. He makes me seem very sober by comparison. He has just been implementing a plan. This is not chaos. Now, whether you like the plan or not, that's a different matter. But he says he wants a much more peaceful world. And to have a more peaceful world, he has to address the points of conflict in the world. So we're going to take the three. Ukraine. In Ukraine, he wants a ceasefire. That, by the way, was what the Minsk Accords were supposed to be about in 2015, I think. That's what they were supposed to be about, negotiated by the Europeans, by the French and the Germans with the Russians. He wants a ceasefire. Now, people say that's outrageous. If you want a ceasefire, you're just conceding to the Russians. And he says, well, it's like this. If you think President Zelensky can win this war and take back 100% of Ukraine, that means taking back the eastern Donbass and Crimea. That constitutes around 18% of Ukraine, of legally defined Ukraine. If you think President Zelensky can take this back, then he should get on with doing so. But if you don't think he can take it back, then what are you going to do? And the military assessments are that Zelensky has no hope of taking back that territory from the Russians. No hope of doing so. His best bet is just to hang on to the other 80 or so % of Ukraine that he still controls. After all, this constitutes a big defeat for Putin, who wanted to take over the whole of Ukraine in February 2022, and he's only left with 18% of it, and he took 10% of it in 2014. So he's only got another 8. I mean, there's some debate about this, but 8 to 10% more of Ukraine since 2022. So remember that. The only way, military assessments are this, the only way you could take back all of that 18% of Ukraine, including Crimea, where the Black Sea Fleet is, the Russian Black Sea Fleet is based, the only way you could take that back would be if the Americans deployed troops and weapons to drive the Russians out. Could they do that? Yes, they could do that. They could do that. And if they did that, they would declare war on Russia, and we would have America at war with Russia. Now, you may think that's a good idea, but if I was the President of the United States, I wouldn't do that. Call me weak, but I wouldn't do that. I would demand that Putin and Zelensky agree to a ceasefire, stop the slaughter, and then sit down and try to negotiate a settlement to the war and a settlement on boundaries and so on. And that's all President Trump is trying to do. I know his language towards Zelensky and his threats of cutting off military aid and intelligence and so on. I mean, he's restoring all these things today. I know that sounded a bit horrific, because the media has painted President Zelensky as a huge hero, the Winston Churchill of Eastern Europe. Well, like all people, he isn't perfect, and he has not been willing to agree to a ceasefire. And President Trump has been demanding that he agree to a ceasefire. So, by the way, he has now agreed to a ceasefire. We'll see whether President Trump can get President Putin to agree to a ceasefire. That could be a lot more difficult, because he doesn't have as much leverage over him. But I'm just making the point to you, there is rationality here. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't like President Trump. He's not my sort of person. I wouldn't go on a camping holiday with him. Mind you, I wouldn't want to go on a camping holiday with anyone. Even Elle Macpherson or my wife. I shouldn't make jokes, because jokes are out in politics. My father always said the one thing in politics you should always remember is never make a joke. And it's pretty much crippled me in politics. There is rationality, though, to Trump's policy on Ukraine. This does not mean that the Americans are going to withdraw from NATO. Of course they're not. They're not going to withdraw from NATO. That's not the intention. But think about this. Russia's GDP, I mean, how powerful is Russia? I mean, is Russia really going to invade Poland and sweep through to Berlin? I mean, are you kidding? They've spent 11 years trying to take Ukraine, and they've taken 18% of it. How do you think they would go against the whole of NATO in the battlefield? This is absurd. Russia's GDP is one-tenth of the European Union's GDP. And you add the UK and Norway to that, it's something like 1/15 of the GDP of Europe. And President Trump's point is, why should taxpayers in Austin, Texas or Boise, Idaho, people like our sister actually, why should they be supporting and paying for the defence of Western Europe, of Europe, Central and Eastern as well as Western Europe, when the Europeans are spending all their money not on defence, which most of them are not, but spending their money on welfare and windmills? I mean, what is the, I mean, that completely lacks, by the way, common sense. Why should Americans be supporting, why should Americans be providing their defence? Sure, provide backup to them, no question of that, if the worst ever would come to the worst. But surely they should be able to defend themselves against Russia with an economy 1/10 the size of the European Union. And that isn't an irrational point of view either. And that's upset the Europeans, but I'll tell you what, it's awoken the Europeans. Because, I mean, Keir Starmer, a Labour Prime Minister, has cut the British aid budget overnight by 40% and has diverted all of that money, all of it, every pound that he's cut from the aid budget into the defence budget. And that's the Labour Party. It gives you a bit of hope for Labour. I mean, unfortunately here they just do the opinion polling and that tells them what to do. They don't have any ideas. But this is not being repeated in continental Europe, but with the election of the Christian Democrats in Germany, Chancellor Merz, as he will become by Easter, I think, he is committed to a very big increase in defence spending in Germany as well. So Trump has finally achieved something the American presidents have been asking Europe to do since JFK was the president, and that is to start spending more on defence and take more responsibility for their own defence. Not total responsibility for their own defence, but more responsibility for their own defence. Just very quickly, on the Middle East, I think Trump is right. The problem in the Middle East is Iran. The so-called Palestinian resistance, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis and so on, they would be nothing without the huge support they get from Iran. I mean, I know they get support, Hamas gets support from Qatar as well. I understand that, and of course a huge amount of support from the UN, particularly through UNRWA, which we should completely withdraw from altogether. We shouldn't be funding an organisation like that, which some of whose members participated in the events of the 7th of October. Participated in support of Hamas. They were part of the operation. I would completely defund the whole show and demand that it be scrapped. But Iran is the problem. And so President Trump has sent a message to the Iranians, and it's quite a simple message. It is, you should stop funding these extremist organisations, and stopping funding the Palestinian resistance, by the way, will be very popular with the Iranian people who don't like the fact that their government is funding the Palestinian resistance. Believe me, they really hate it. President Trump has demanded that come to an end, and the Iranians do seem to be getting that message. And he's also said one other thing to them, unequivocally. And that is, if they go ahead with a nuclear weapons program, the Americans and the Israelis will destroy it. And they need to understand there will be war, and they will destroy it. There won't be negotiations, there will be planes with bombs. And I thought it was illustrative of this point when the Trump administration, led by the Secretary of State, met with the Russians in Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago. And in those negotiations about, the beginning of negotiations, scoping talks, if you like, on this issue of the ceasefire in Ukraine, the American side linked the provision of anti-aircraft missile systems to the Iranians with these negotiations on Ukraine, saying to the Russians they didn't want them to even think of replacing Iran's destroyed by the Israelis missile systems, anti-aircraft missile systems, with updated Russian systems. I mean, it's illustrative of a point that the Trump administration is being very tough on Iran, which is where the toughness needs to be. Previous governments, American administrations, the European governments, have got into endless nuclear talks with the Iranians, designed to trade a decision to postpone, not to cancel, postpone any development of a nuclear weapon for 10 years or so in exchange for the lifting of economic sanctions against Iran. I mean, talk about weakness being provocative. This was an incredibly bad policy and just empowered the Iranians and encouraged them to give support to the Palestinian resistance and other movements, including in Iraq, Shia militias in Iraq. So my point is the Trump administration has returned to the policy that Trump 1 had, which was maximum pressure on Iran. And you can argue with me, but I think this is the pathway to peace in the Middle East. I know what he said about Gaza and creating Mare Gaza, as they call it, is funny. It's not obviously going to happen, and he knows it's not going to happen. He's just having you on, but he's just making the point. He's just, in a way that none of us ever would, by the way, because it's a serious issue, not a joking issue, but making the point that Hamas cannot run that place anymore. That's coming to an end. That's finished. That's not going to happen again. You know, the Arab states can start working out a way of handling that and dealing with it. And as you can see, the Saudis and the Egyptians have done just that. All this is good news, not bad news. This is not chaos, this is a plan. So finally, there's China, the puppeteer, right? I always say Russia has become pretty much a puppet state of China because they're totally dependent on China to be able to afford to fight this war. And what can the Trump administration, what can the West do about China? Again, it's about making it clear. We're happy to engage with China and trade with China, but don't come and steal our technology. Don't attack us through cyber attacks or other sort of nefarious methods. Don't try to breach international law and take over the whole of the South China Sea and inhibit trafficking through trade through the South China Sea. And importantly, stop threatening Taiwan. Because if you attack Taiwan, it will lead to a huge and catastrophic meltdown. As President Trump said the other day, an attack on Taiwan will be bad in terms of super microchips and so on, but it would be a catastrophe. He used that word, it would be a catastrophe. That's right, it would be a catastrophe. It wouldn't be just an attack on a small island of 20 million people. It would be a lot more serious than that. So what do I think through all of this chaos? There's much good that will come of it. And I think this will work. I think this plan will work. And I think people like Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, maybe Merz, the incoming Chancellor of Germany, they're beginning to see this. Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, she absolutely is all signed up to it as well. So my last word is about the issue that's hit us today, the tariffs. I'm very against tariffs. I am passionately for free trade. I was the Foreign Minister who was involved in triggering the negotiations on the free trade agreement with the United States itself. This is in breach of the spirit and the letter of that agreement, by the way, though there are legal explanations for it, which I won't bore you with, was involved with the free trade agreements with Thailand and Singapore, got the Japanese Prime Minister Koizumi to agree to begin negotiations on a free trade agreement with Japan, and sat down with Bo Xilai, and Brad was definitely there, Bo Xilai, the then Chinese Commerce Minister, and persuaded him that we should have negotiations on a free trade agreement, which we eventually did negotiate. So trust me, I am hugely in favour of free trade and against tariffs. But President Trump made it clear all through last year's campaign that if he won the election there would be tariffs. I saw him saying time and time again, I love that word tariff. I'm thinking to myself, that's where you and I absolutely part company, but he loves it. Why? Because he wants to rebuild the manufacturing base of the United States. He thinks it's madness for the United States to contract out its manufacturing to China in particular, but to India and Vietnam and wherever else. Mexico, of course, importantly, possibly even Canada. I think it's very bad diplomacy, and I think it's bad economics to try to solve America's economic problems that way. But that is the path he's chosen. Could we get an exemption? I'm sorry, I never thought we could and we can't. Not even Kevin Rudd could pull that off. We let Kevin know that when I said that everyone laughed. I'd love to tell him. But you know, I don't think it was ever going to be feasible. Trump wants to rebuild the American steel and aluminium industry. And this helps us to reflect on something we've done in this country. That although we reduced tariffs to make our economy more competitive, and you know, we did that from the mid-1980s onwards, and that's been very successful for Australia, we at the same time started to increase the costs of manufacturing in this country. And then I'll just say this to you, because none of you are going to agree with me here. In the last 10 years, we have massively increased the cost of energy in this country, where once its comparative advantage was cheap energy. We have massively increased the cost of energy because we thought by doing so we would change the weather. Well, good luck to you. You all believe that, and good luck to you. I think we're as likely to change the weather as we are to build 8 nuclear-powered submarines in Adelaide. I don't think that's going to happen. I always say, of the 3 predictions for 2050, which is the most likely? We build 8 nuclear submarines in Adelaide, we achieve net zero, or there's a second coming. And I'll tell you what my view is. 2 of those, there is no hope at all. And one of them, when it comes to the second coming, honestly, I'll be frank with you, I'm a bit of a know-all, but I have absolutely no idea. It might happen, or it might not. But we'll see. So thank you very much for listening to me. And it's great to
I remember I was working in your office when Sergei Lavrov became the foreign minister, and I took him to you with great excitement as a minister of submission, or administered as a new foreign minister in Russia. What does it mean? And I remember you saying at the time, I think he'd been the permanent representative to the UN. And he said,
so I knew him.
Yeah, he said, I know him. He's not a good man. And that was in about 2004.
He makes, I tell you what though, he makes good jokes. So if you look at him on TV, he looks a lugubrious sort of person, all deadly serious and sad, and I mean he's a completely negative person. He must be one of the worst foreign ministers in the world. And he would have to be the longest serving, by the way. But he surprises you with his jokes. So he's quite... And Putin, by the way, is another person who makes jokes. That was kind of... I mean, Putin has made me laugh.
And another figure you mentioned, Bourgeois, of course, made an unhappy ending as part of Xi Jinping.
I think he's still alive. He hasn't been executed, has he? He's in jail, though.
He's in jail.
He's been in jail for 20 years?
Since about 2012, I think, wasn't Shortly after Xi came to power.
It wouldn't have been straight after. Yeah.
How does the West, you talked about how the West sort of lost its collective confidence after the global financial crisis, after what was seen to be unsuccessful interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. How does the West get its confidence back, and will the Trump administration help them rediscover that sense of sort of self?
Well, I think they're doing a good job, because I think if he can force the Russians, because he's forced the Ukrainians now, if he can force the Russians into a ceasefire, that at the same time force the Europeans, let's think of a best case scenario, into providing a peacekeeping force in Ukraine. The Russians don't agree to that at the moment, but let's wait and see what happens in the negotiations. There will be a quid pro quo available there for the Russians, so it may be possible. And if that were to happen, and the Europeans genuinely do increase their spending and capacity on defence and take more responsibility for European defence, that, by the way, is a huge step forward. If the moderates, so there's a great battle, you know this as well as me, there's a great battle going on in Iran between the moderates and the extremists. And
moderates is a relative term.
Yeah, but the moderates,
they are
the moderates
extremists.
Don't want war with Israel,
No.
right? And the moderates don't want to go ahead with developing a nuclear weapon.
No.
Well, that's moderate. That makes all of us moderates, actually, because we don't want Australia to have nuclear weapons. Well, not at the moment, anyway. That battle is going on. If American pressure, particularly economic pressure, forces Iran into more and more restrictions on people's living standards, and the Americans are going to put a lot of pressure on China, and particularly the Chinese banking system, over the support they give to Iran, to facilitate the Iranian economy. Let's be honest. If the Americans can succeed in doing that, this does offer a complete change to the Middle East. If they can get Iran out of being the troublemaker in the Middle East, that will make a very big difference. And so this is a real reassertion of the power of the West, and balance China's power and make sure there is effective deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. Deterrence that, if you like, Xi Jinping and the Chinese can believe in. This will be a huge re-entry of the West into global security. And I'm optimistic about this, because I think the difference between Trump and a lot of political leaders, there are very bad things, don't get me wrong, about Trump. And I told you tariffs is a very bad thing. But there are good things about Trump. And one of them is he understands power. And I don't think a lot of leaders, including our own Prime Minister, who's obviously a marvellous Prime Minister, but he doesn't understand power. He doesn't use the power of this nation to achieve things. Trump understands the power of America, the huge economic and military power that country has. And the thing about it is he's prepared to use it to force, and he's brutal in the way he does it. He's brutal, way more brutal than any of us, I'm sure, would ever dream of being. But to force good outcomes for America here, there and everywhere. He's a lot of bad things, Trump, but he's not weak. And that's what Biden, there are a lot of good things about Joe Biden. Obviously, I had a meeting with Joe Biden when he was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He talked for the full half hour of the meeting. I have no idea what he said, but he just talked at me. Didn't ask me any questions, didn't draw a breath, just talked and talked and talked, and that was Joe Biden. He's weak. That's what he is. He's weak. And I thought Obama, you know, his soaring rhetoric and all of that is quite impressive, his rhetoric. I'll give him that. But he's weak. And Trump is a lot of things, but he's not weak. And he knows how to use power, and that is a very good thing for the West.
So let's just talk a little bit about national power, because when you're in government, you know, the balance sheet was healthy, the budget was in good shape, the economy was growing, we had productivity growth year on year. Australia was
Do you remember those days?
Australia was an attractive place to invest. Our defence forces were growing in size. We were acquiring new capabilities. Now we've got, you know, 7 quarters of negative GDP per capita growth, stagnant productivity, declining living standards. I mean, you talked about a loss of confidence of the West collectively. It feels like there's a loss of confidence in Australia and our own ability to advance and deliver and progress. How much does that influence the impact we can have on the international stage as sort of the domestic malaise that we seem to be?
I think it's a very good question, and I think we need as a country to think about this. We have lost, I'm sorry to say, it's not just over the last 3 years of Labor government. I think we're over a decade or so, we have lost our soft power. When I went to London as the High Commissioner, there was a company there, I've forgotten its name now, it'll come to me in the middle of the night, I'm sure, that used to produce every year a soft power index. And the first year I was there, 2014, Australia was 5th in the world in terms of its soft power and influence. That company doesn't exist anymore. They're sort of wound up and merged with someone else, and the index isn't produced anymore.
Is it Legatum Institute?
No, it's not a think tank. It was a consultancy firm. I think today Australia wouldn't make the top 20 in terms of soft power. So here is my anecdotal impression. When I'm in America these days, or in the UK, or in continental Europe, almost no one asks me about Australia. How do you do this? How does that work in Australia? 10 years ago, they always would. People were really interested in what we did in Australia, how we achieved it. I was flown to Argentina once by a think tank. It would have been in about 2014 or 15, so about 10 years ago. I was flown to Argentina to explain to a huge crowd of business people, politicians, state politicians, national politicians, local government politicians, business people, trade unionists and so on. How did Australia achieve these miraculous economic reforms over the previous 20 or so years? They were really interested in that. I think nothing is happening in this country that interests people in the outside world. I mean, you know, we're spending all our money on building windmills and things. And what do people think? I mean, the last time I heard of this story of windmills, that was Don Quixote, wasn't it? And that ended up well. This is ending up the same way. I mean, we're spending huge amounts of money doing this, and we're not achieving. I mean, what's the metric you're using to measure the outcome of your expenditure? Nobody has any idea. The answer is almost nothing. We're almost achieving almost nothing, and we're using up our national resources doing things like that. People aren't interested, honestly. In Europe and in America, they're just not interested. And they became interested in us because of our economic reforms and our huge economic performance. I mean, I remember making a speech in New York to the business community there, a big dinner, much wine, drunk. They laughed at my jokes, which in America is an achievement because they have a different sense of humour. And don't make jokes about America, of course. Don't do that with the Americans. You'll get the bread rolls thrown at you if you do that. But when I told them that we had a budget surplus of whatever it was, 1% or 2% of GDP, We had paid off all government debt, every single cent of government debt. We had a 4% unemployment with 8% unemployment rate. We had an economic growth rate of around 4%. There was a standing ovation. I mean, what would you tell them now? What would you tell them? Well, I mean, what have we got to show for our performance as a country over the last 10 years? It's a woeful performance. I mean, somebody comes from the Howard government and you would be saying he's way past his use-by date, this guy. We don't want to hear from people of the past anymore. I can understand that. But I can tell you this, it's been a woeful performance over the last few years in this country. We have huge and mounting debts. We have we have economic growth of 1.2% or something, anemic economic growth, relatively low unemployment, it's true. Everybody has that, of course, around the world for one reason or another. But we have nothing to boast. And where is our defence force? I mean, we're using Virgin Airlines.
Yeah.
We're using Virgin Airlines to detect the Chinese fleet. I mean, what do you think they're thinking in the US military or in the London Ministry of Defence when they see the pilot of a Virgin airliner discovered the Chinese fleet, not the Australian Defence Force? I mean, it makes you cringe. That's not soft power. That's not soft power. I mean, I can tell you what the British do. Whenever Russian planes or ships come anywhere near British waters, the RAF and the Royal Navy are up there straight away, and not only do they shadow them, they take photographs of them and they send them all to the media, and they make sure there's plenty of media coverage about how HMS something, you know, HMS Trowbridge or something, has been shadowing the Russian such and such a ship, and you know, P-8 aircraft have been following their planes and so on. They put it all in the media. I mean, it's an assertion of power, if you like, soft power. We've just become completely complacent. I find it, I mean, I'm sure none of you agree with me, but I find it really depressing.
When you left government in 2017, China was about the third or fourth largest economy, roughly the size of Germany's economy at the time. Didn't really have a big blue water navy capability, certainly wouldn't have sent a PLA Navy task force off our coast, and was largely, and you touched on this in your speech, largely a status quo international power, with the big hope being that China could be made a responsible stakeholder, I think was the phrase in Bob's earlier. So what are the lessons from, and you know, we in your government was seen as having managed that relationship very adroitly at the time. Are there lessons though from that era that can be applied to China today, which is quite a different beast to China of the early 2000s?
I think most of the fault lies with China, by the way, not with us. But I would start by saying make sure that the allies that in this part of the world includes South Korea, Japan, Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, and to some extent India, make sure we have, and of course the Americans, make sure we have effective deterrence capability. So that's the message to send to China. We have this very sophisticated, very effective defence capability, and do take that into account when you're thinking about what you're doing and what your ambitions are. And do take into account the fact that we won't be too frightened to use it. We will use this defence capability if we have to. We don't want to, but we will if we have to.